Today we're going to put the clasp on one end of our pearl necklace. So I've got everything ready here, but before we start, it's worth just mentioning that when you buy pearls, they usually come on a string and they've not been knotted, just so that you can look at them. But you have to be sure that if they've been graduated, as these have been, which means the largest one here is at the bottom, you need to make sure that you've got the same number of pearls each side of the big one, and that therefore the necklace will hang evenly. The other thing to remember is that if you want to make earrings to go with your necklace, drop earrings, then you need to choose the pearls from the string before you make up the rest of the necklace and take out the pearls that you want for earrings. But we're not going to do that for this project. We'll do that in a later posting. So just to start then, these are the pearls ready to string. I've got my bead cord here, and I've got these little tiny bits and pieces that we need for the clasp. This is the clasp itself. It's a ring bolt clasp, which means that it's a trigger back, so you pull back on the trigger. It's always difficult to do when there are no pearls attached. And it opens the clasp. As you can see, the clasp is beginning to open there. And this little ring will slip off. And that's what you use for the other end. So if I open it up, you can see it divides into two pieces. Now, when I put a clasp on, I always put it on in the closed position. In other words, I join it back up again, just in case during the process of knotting, I lose that little tiny piece of silver, and it would be a nuisance if you did that halfway through a project. So keep the clasp in a closed position. You'll need two end beads. These are end beads. These are 4mm silver end beads in this case, but you can get lots of different ones. It's got a disproportionately large hole, and that's because we're going to pass the silk twice through this little tiny bead, and therefore it needs a bigger hole. You've also got two little pieces of what we call gimp or French wire. Now this is very awkward stuff to use, and you have to be very careful with it. So I'm going to take this little bent piece here and just show you what happens if you misuse it. If you imagine this is like a little tiny metal fairy bed spring, it's going round and round and round. It's made of silver and it's wire. Well, you have to thread the needle through the middle of the hole of the little spring, but if you catch it on anything, can you see what happens? It opens up, and therefore it gets ruined, I'm afraid. Once you've spread it like that, you can't use it. So you have to be very careful with gimp, especially when you're threading it. That's just a bit of danger there ahead of time. But let's start. So I'm going to take my silk out, and this is a new bolt of silk. There are 2 meters of silk on this particular bolt, and the needle here is wound around the card. And then I'm just going to untangle the silk from the card. Well, it's not tangled really, it's just rolled round. But because it's a new bolt of silk, there's 2 meters of it. So you have to be aware that you've got a lot of silk to manage. Now the needle, which is integral to the silk, you can see where it's joined on here, is a bit bent when it comes off the card. So taking your pair of pliers, we're just going to straighten that needle out to make it a lot easier to use. Every so often it's a good idea to get your pliers and straighten out the needle. Be careful you don't pick up your cutters instead, because you'll cut the needle in half if you do that. So there's our needle a little bit straighter. So we're ready now, and I'm going to mount the clasp. Now the first thing that we put on the end of our clasp is one of the end beads. So we thread that end bead first, which is quite easy because it's got a big hole, onto the needle and onto the silk. And then we have to thread the gimp. Now this is the bit where you have to be careful not to spread it. So I'm just going to poke the needle into the end of the gimp. Oops, I'll lift it up so you can see a bit more clearly. There we are. And slide it onto the needle like that. And when it slides down to where the needle and the silk meet, I'm just going to pull it gently over there, because that's the bit where it might catch and spread. But there it is now, safely on the silk. And now we're going to thread the clasp on, and the clasp has a loop at one end, and we're going to just thread that through the loop. So we've now got 3 things on our silk: a bead, a clasp, and the piece of gimp. The clasp and the bead can slide over the gimp occasionally, don't worry about that. As long as they're all three on there and you've got them in that order, they're fine. Now, in order to get this right down to the bottom end of the silk, I'm just going to pinch them very gently and pull the silk through to get to the end of the silk. Now, if you're worried about everything falling off the end of the silk, which when you first start can happen, you can use either a knot and tie a knot in the end of the silk, or one of these bead extenders, which we just clip gently onto the end of the silk, and then nothing will fall off that. Bead stoppers are a very good idea if you haven't got one. But to make it easier for you to see what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the bead stopper off just for this demonstration. So we've got the three things now on our silk, and they're really right at the very end here. There's the end bead and the piece of gimp and the clasp. And now what I'm going to do is to mount the clasp, which means I've got to make a loop. And I'm going to make a loop in the silk that catches the clasp in the loop. And to do that, we have to pass the needle back through the end bead for a second time, this time in the opposite direction. So it goes through. And if you pull it gently, you can now tighten up the loop of the silk. So if I keep pulling, you'll see that we'll end up with a loop like this. It takes a bit of time if you've got 2 meters of silk. It gets shorter the more necklaces you use from your silk, of course. And then we end up with just a loop. You can probably see it quite clearly there. There's a loop of silk containing the clasp and the gimp and passing twice through the end bead. And if I'm very careful now and show you by pulling gently, I'm going to pull on the silk, and you can see the loop is closing, and it's closing over the gimp so that the gimp forms a little silver loop. And that's what the gimp is for. It's there to protect the silk from the clasp of wearing it, and it also makes it look much neater. And by tightening up like that, you've ended up with a very neat finish on the end of the necklace. Now, before you get too excited, we need to tie the silk in a knot so that it doesn't fall off. So just taking the end of the silk, I'm going to tie one knot, and because I'm a bit nervous about ends, I usually tie 2 knots. So I've tied those silk ends together. You can give it a little tug with your pliers to make sure it's really tight, and there we have a mounted clasp. Now, before we leave it, we're going to have to cut off this piece of silk that you no longer want. And this is, for this part, we need the glue. Now, in the olden days, silk necklaces were sealed with a little bit of sealing wax, which stopped the silk fraying. Nowadays, we tend to use super glue. And I'm using an old bead card here and a needle and a little bottle of super glue. I prefer the bottles. They don't dry out as much as the tubes. You put a tiny dot on the bottle. Don't forget to put the lid back on. Put it well out of the way so that it doesn't interfere with your silks. Using the end of a needle, what I'm going to do is dip the needle in the super glue, just the end there, and then very carefully and gently touch it against the silk that I'm going to cut off. Don't touch it on the wrong end, and try not to get it on the knot. You don't want to get it on the knot because super glue makes silk go hard, as you'll see, and you don't want the knot to get hard and brittle because it might break in the future. So once you've got that tiny little bit of super glue on there, I'll put the super glue out of the way so I don't trail my silk through it, and then give it a second or two to dry. And it really only does take a second or two. You can probably see it glistening there in the light. Now if I push on it, you can see that bit of silk has gone very stiff where the glue has stiffened it. So it's ready to cut off. So I'm going to use an old pair of cutters that I managed to drop on the floor and broke the end. But they're useful now as a pair of glue cutters so that I don't get glue on any of my proper cutters. With the flat side of the cutter to the work, you cut within 1 millimetre of the knot. It's quite close. And you cut it through the bit of silk that you no longer want. And there is our clasp, beautifully mounted and knotted in place with the silk sealed with a little bit of glue. And we're ready now to knot the necklace. I'm not going to knot the entire necklace today, but what I will do is just put the first pearl on so that you can see what it looks like. So on goes the first pearl through the 2 meters of silk and down to the end. And there you'll begin to see how each pearl will now join next to each other. And we've now got to go all the way around the necklace, knotting it all the way around. And in the next post, I will show you how to put the end on the opposite end of the necklace to complete it. So thank you for joining me. Remember the health and safety and all these things. Sharp tools, you must be careful of your cutters, but most particularly be careful of your super glue. Don't get it on yourself or children or pets. And that tiny drop, keep it well out of the way of everything and you'll be fine. So thank you again for listening, and go away and practice a bit more knotting and putting on an end and see how you get on, and come back and I'll show you how we can complete the necklace. Thank you again. Bye now.